This story begins as most humble D&D stories do. Four friends in high school around a table on a weekend playing some good old D&D. Chris, Anthony, Daryl, and I decided it was time to start a new campaign, but this time it was different. Our DM Daryl's little brother Stevey would be joining us on our adventure. It wasn't something we wanted, but Daryl's mom asked nicely if we could include him in our game. Being that Daryl's house was the only place we could consistently play on the weekend, we happily accepted. Little Stevey hadn't ever played D&D before. He wanted to play something that was a ninja, so a monk it was. But he also wanted to be able to do Professor Xavier brain stuff, so a monk scion it was. And thus, Stevey the monk scion was born. As for the rest of us, Chris decided to be a barbarian, Anthony chose a cleric, and myself, I was a bard, although none of it would matter in regards to how powerful Stevey would become. Stevey started the campaign like most power-hungry kids would. The fight would begin, and Stevey would run in like a screeching howler monkey. Anthony the cleric would have to spend most of his turns healing Stevey, as Stevey the monk became the main target of every encounter. We'd ask Stevey to use some modicum of strategy, to which he'd immediately decline every single time. Stevey was above patience. He didn't have time for that. However, Stevey wasn't completely stupid. He picked up the ability Empathic Transfer Hostile. The way it worked was simple. All the damage Stevey had taken in a round would be transferred to the enemy, and Stevey would heal the difference. And oh, did Stevey like using it. Always being the one constantly waffle-stomped by enemies to the point of near death, he quickly fell in love with it. As the campaign went on, Stevey would have to become more creative. At one point he realized the damage he was taking in fights just wasn't quite as much as he wanted. During one fight in particular, I happened to critically fail throwing an acid flask and hit Stevey directly in the face. He took some damage, but more than that, his eyes widened with glee. Stevey empathic transferred that damage to a slad and watched him melt with the eyes of a future serial killer. After that, every fight would be Stevey drinking an acid flask, smashing an alchemist fire on his head, while holding a lit bomb. This would quickly be followed by a gentle pat on the back to an orc, kobold, or a golem, it didn't matter. Like Icarus, Stevey was flying too close to the sun. Sometimes he would get so low that he went unconscious from his own suicidal tendencies. With the help of Cleric Anthony, they found a solution. The spell, Delay Death. It would prevent Stevey from being reduced below 0 health for a few rounds. With this combo, Stevey had triumphed over death and he could risk every free strike, stand in a fire, cover himself in acid while exploding, without even the faintest hint of fear. Stevey had become suicidal death incarnate. At the gentlest touch, most monsters would fall to uncanny wounds, and only the highest level monsters would be able to fight Stevey toe-to-toe. As long as he had some healing near the end of Delayed Death, he would be A-OK. I wish I could say that this was the end of Stevey's suicidal reign of terror, but there was one final step, the missing link. One day, while climbing a mountain, Stevey had failed a climb check, and he took some fall damage. For Stevey, mountains quaked as his brain synapses fired on all cylinders. Stevey politely asked for the wand of teleport that we'd been using to travel, and with this final act, nothing would ever challenge Stevey again. The fights thereafter would always follow the same procedure. Stevey would teleport into the sky as far as the eye could see and race down at terminal velocity while covered in acid, fire, and exploding, all the while laughing at death like some inconsequential annoyance. After the impact, Stevey would crawl from his crater and graciously hug his foe, watching them split asunder from the massive amounts of fall damage combined with burning acid and explosions. If creatures in the monster manual could have nightmares, they would have nightmares of Stevey. A group of giants terrorizing your city? Stevey was on it. A beholder killing your local miners? Stevey had their back. A vampire stealing women and children out of your town at night? Stevey would ensure that this town would prosper for 100 years. As you might have guessed, the campaign grew stale, and Stevey single-handedly would win every fight while ascending to something that resembled nigh godhood. Luckily, we were near the end of the road for this campaign. We had found out an evil wizard had been behind all the terrible events during this adventure. Our duty was clear. We geared up for what would be our last and final battle. We had fought our way to the base of his wizard tower. Stevey naturally approached first and looked him directly in the eye. The wizard bellowed, "We end this now," readying his staff to unleash his deadly forces. Almost motionless, a figure whose nerves and grace were cut from marble, like a new god form for mankind, Stevey tilted his head towards the wizard and was gone. Above, a speck of barreling light drove down from the heavens, a bright flaming comet of acid exploding suicidal death vengeance. With the fury of 1,000 suns, Stevey collided with the earth in spectacular fashion. Out of a plume of dust, Stevey emerged from his blasted crater, his clothes burnt to ash, buried nothing but the chain loincloth to preserve his modesty. Stevey took several slow steps towards the wizard and reached out his palm. But then, in a flash, the wizard was gone. In fact, most everything had disappeared. The slaughtered enemies, the tower, all gone. All of us stood bewildered, but then interrupted a loud and booming voice. Sometimes illusions can be the most fatal. None of it had happened, and slowly Stevey came to realize his deadly predicament. In a minute, the effects of delayed death would wear off, and he would be left to endure his godly flight alone. The gravity of the situation set in, and our characters took one last look at our savior. We couldn't even hug him goodbye. It would confirm our certain death. Stevey could only muster a faint "wah" before he atomized before us. Ashes to ashes, Stevey, and he returned to the world that had once made him whole. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the story of Stevey the Crater Monk.